Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization 2. Today we are going to look at the rise of fascism and Nazism. Our focus question is going to be, how did the political, economic, and ideological conditions of the interwar period contribute to the rise of the Nazi Party, and how did this facilitate the shift from systematic persecution to the genocide known as the Holocaust? So grab a pen and paper, a tablet and keyboard, and let's begin. We'll pick up our story where we last left off, at the end of World War I. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles had been signed. It brought the victorious powers to the table, and decisions were made about what to do with Germany. After 4 long and brutal years of warfare, the victorious powers were not in a mood to be charitable to Germany. And so a humiliating peace treaty was imposed upon them. The idea of the treaty was not only to punish the Germans, but also to make sure that they could never rise again. These feelings were particularly strong among the French, who had suffered greatly and who had lived under the shadow of the Germans since the Franco-Prussian War. Part of the treaty would see territorial losses on the part of the Germans, particularly in the east, where territories were seized and parts of what had been the German Empire were taken to create new states like Czechoslovakia and Poland. The treaty also imposed harsh restrictions on the German military. The German military was supposed to be just a small peacekeeping force, and entire areas along the borders of France were to be completely demilitarized. Germany was also punished economically. They were forced to pay heavy reparations as a way to compensate the victorious powers for their losses. Unfortunately for Germany, it was unable to actually pay these exorbitant prices, mostly because it too had been greatly damaged in the course of the war. In order to get out from these heavy payments, the German central bank had settled on the solution of inflating the currency, essentially making the German mark completely worthless. While this did ease its abilities to pay for the war losses, it also created heavy inflation. This inflationary cycle completely wiped out the savings of many middle-class people. And so people who had formerly been comfortable or middle class now found themselves reduced to poverty. And so across Germany in the post-war years, there was a widespread misery, economic decline, as well as the personal and human losses that the war had caused. The government that was set up in the wake of World War I became known as the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic had a constitution that was broadly liberal. It included such provisions as universal suffrage and included civil liberties. Among optimists, it was hoped that this would be a way for Germany to join the club of civilized and developed nations and leave behind its warlike past. Unfortunately, the new government was created during a time of great turmoil in Germany, with death and devastation, war losses, and a humiliating treaty. The new government was quickly marginalized. In the minds of many Germans, this government, which had been forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, lacked legitimacy. Furthermore, there were too many parties, and it became difficult for any one of them to get a governing majority. The new government faced challenges both from the far left, groups who wished to bring Germany closer into the socialist or maybe even communist orbit, and also from far right groups who were who felt that the humiliation of the treaty made the new government illegitimate. The new government was facing difficult economic times at best, but the Great Depression of 1929 just further destroyed the economy of an already struggling nation. The 1920s would also see the rise of new radical ideologies, particularly fascism. Fascism had begun in Italy and was made popular by Benito Mussolini, who came to power in the 1920s. Some of the key features of fascism were strong nationalist ideologies. Fascists particularly looked to the past, usually the mythical past, a time when things were great. In the case of Mussolini, he saw the ancient Roman Empire as a model. As a matter of fact, the word fascism comes from the symbol used by the ancient Roman consuls. And for Mussolini, this was the glory time of Italy, and he promised to bring back these glory days and promised future greatness. And so while it could look different in different countries, with fascism, usually there is a romantic notion of the ancient past. Part of Mussolini's fascism was also a strong authoritarian bent to it. Power would be lodged in the hands of a dictator, or at least a single party. In Italy, of course, this was Mussolini and the fascists. And the suppression of opposition parties. Finally, fascists emphasized militarism. Fascist governments glorified the military and war in general. An aggressive foreign policy was often seen as a means to achieve political ends, and broadly speaking, fascists tended to be expansionistic. The idea that it was the destiny of the nation to expand at the expense of its perceived enemies. Finally, Mussolini used party members in parallel military forces to begin to intimidate rivals and to ultimately gain power. Often this involved violent street brawls and the use of fascist paramilitary forces to intimidate rivals. The 1920s also saw the rise of another would-be strongman, and of course this is Adolf Hitler. Hitler had served as a corporal in the German army during World War I and had found the army to be, and war to actually be great. He enjoyed the camaraderie of troops in the trenches. He appreciated the life of the military with its order and discipline, and grew greatly disillusioned after the surrender at Versailles. In the post-war years, he settled in Munich. And again, this is an environment, it's important to remember, this is an environment where grievance is in the air. The new Weimar government had just signed the peace treaty. Germany was suffering all sorts of financial and human loss. And it was in this environment that Hitler became attracted to a radical, fringy, racist ideology that would eventually become the Nazi Party. The Nazis had combined elements of Mussolini's fascism. They had seen in this fascist movement a way to galvanize the public and to dismantle the political system, which they saw as illegitimate and corrupt. Hitler and the Nazis would add several elements to Mussolini's fascism. Part of Nazi ideology was a radical racial ideology that was added to it. For the Nazis, the Aryan or the Germanic type peoples were superior to other peoples, and they scapegoated the Jews as enemies of the Aryans and blamed them for Germany's current economic woes. Ideas like the stab in the back theory, that Jews had been responsible for stabbing the German people in the back by signing the peace treaty, or because of their perceived involvement in capitalist policies that were supposedly causing Germany's current economic woes. And so with this idea of Aryan superiority and hatred of the Jews, this was an important racial element that was added to Nazi ideology. There were other elements, though. Part of the ideology was the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. Essentially, this was the idea that in order to fulfill its destiny and become the great nation, that the Germanic peoples were going to need to acquire new lands. These lands, it was imagined, would come from the east, and at the expense of its Slavic neighbors, Poland and the hated Soviet Union. This new land would be opened up to German settlers and would allow them to finally reach their supposed future destiny. Like Mussolini, the Nazis believed in a strong leader for the party. And this became known as the Führerprinzip, or the Führer principle, strong leader. It was believed that a strong leader would be needed, and these ideas again were combined with romantic ideals about the will of the leader equaling the will of the nation as a whole. And so it was to this nascent Nazi party that Hitler began to become attracted and eventually join. Hitler first rose to national prominence through a failed coup attempt, which became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Putsch is just German for a coup or a violent overthrow. In 1923, in Munich, Hitler and a few of the Nazi radicals known as the SA, also sometimes called stormtroopers or brown shirts. These were paramilitary forces analogous to Mussolini's. They attempted a violent overthrow of the government. Now, the putsch was never a real serious threat, and in the minds of many people was actually quite comical, leaving a beer hall to try to seize the government. But it did land Hitler some jail time. Hitler spent several months in jail in 1924 before being released, but he made good use of his time. While in jail, he wrote Mein Kampf, which was his personal autobiography, where he first published some of his racial grievances and his beliefs about the future of Germany. Well, anyways, his involvement in the failed putsch, as well as the publication of his book, propelled Hitler to national prominence for the first time. The Nazis, after the failed coup in 1923, began to focus more on democratic means of achieving power. At first, they were only able to secure small gains in the German Diet, but as the 20s progressed, they honed their techniques, focusing on grievance, on perceived wrongs, on people's prejudices, to rise to increasing numbers in the Diet. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, this supercharged the appeal of the Nazis, though. They had been focusing on grievance and injustice throughout the 20s, and with this just horrible economic problems, now they won large majorities or large percentages in the German Diet for the first time. By 1930, they were the second largest party. With their electoral successes, Hitler was able to have himself appointed as Chancellor, the highest ranking position in the German government, in 1932. Hitler began to use his new platform to promise to restore Germany to past glories and to further enhance his party's prospects. In 1933, a very pivotal event occurred. In February, the Reichstag, or the German Legislative Assembly, was lit on fire. It's still not clear who exactly lit the fire. Some actually suspected the Nazis themselves of doing it, but it's possible others did it. Nonetheless, the communists, the arch-enemies of the Nazis, were blamed for it. By March of that year, just a few weeks later, the enabling acts were passed. These acts gave Hitler and the Nazis the ability to enact broad reforms. So this was the fire was looked upon as a terrorist act, and these were going to be laws that were supposedly going to enable them to deal with terrorists. Hitler and the Nazis used these laws to their own advantage. They were given broad powers to pass legislation without parliamentary approval, and they used these powers to begin to purge the government of their enemies. And so opposition parties were outlawed, and non-Nazis were purged from high-ranking positions in the civil service and in the judiciary. Hitler and the Nazis also established the Gestapo. This was a secret police force that would begin to terrorize political enemies. And they also began to use their position to erode civil liberties broadly. And they used their new power in the judiciary to begin to punish opponents. This began a spiral that would eventually lead to Hitler gaining absolute power and would begin the harassment and intimidation of opponents. Hitler and the Nazis, especially his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, also began a propaganda campaign to begin to mold public opinion and bend the German people toward Nazi ideology. Goebbels' propaganda machine left no area untouched, whether it was media, art, or education. The German public was indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. Hitler was promoted as the savior of Germany, and the Nazis proved to be very adept at using new media like radio and other mass media to promote their message. The Nazis also were fond of large rallies. These rallies would be very dramatic events, usually featuring gigantic crowds, speeches by Hitler, bands, marching bands, sometimes torchlight vigils, and basically these were gigantic events that began to meld the mind of the German people and around the cult of personality that Hitler was beginning to develop for himself. With their popularity rising and their position in government firmly in place, the Nazis began to turn their attention toward racial policies. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws, as they were called, were passed. There were basically two parts to this. Part was the Reich citizenship law, which deprived Jews of citizenship and made them subject directly to the state, and also the laws for the protection of German blood and honor, which prohibited the marriage and intercourse of Jews and Germans, and also prohibited Germans from working in Jewish homes as maids. The propaganda campaign was also kicked into full gear. Jews were dehumanized in the press, and attempts were made to normalize discrimination against them. Whether it was in film, newspaper, or educational material, Jews were portrayed as subhuman or degenerate or both. And it's around this time that public signs began to appear that Jews were not welcome. Jews were also targeted for boycotts, and this began to reduce many of them to poverty. Their rights to operate a business were eventually stripped from them. And beginning in 1938, in what became known as the Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, pogroms or state-led violence was directed at them. And over the course of a few nights, Jewish synagogues were set on fire, and Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed by by brown shirts and other Nazi sympathizers. And Jews were subjected to not only violence but also various forms of humiliation. As war began to break out in 1939, Jews were finally physically segregated and put into ghettos. They were forced to ID themselves with yellow stars and isolated and stripped from the community as a whole. The late 30s would also see Adolf Hitler begin to militarize. For a long time, Germans had felt that the provisions that prevented them from having an army were unfair, and Hitler played to these grievances. Against the advice of his generals in 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland. This was the area along the French border that the Treaty of Versailles had stipulated that German troops should not militarize, but Hitler did it anyways. By the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, this should have meant an action by the Allies as a response for this violation, but the Allies themselves were dealing with the Depression and were apprehensive about military action as they were still licking their own wounds from World War I, and so nothing happened. In Hitler's mind, this further indicated to him that he was a military genius, since he had defied not only the Allies but many of his generals. And in the minds of some of the public, this also furthered that notion. In 1938, Hitler was on the move again in what became known as the Anschluss. Austria was annexed. Now, this wasn't necessarily a hostile action. Many Austrians after the war had wanted to join Germany but were forbidden by the Allies. They saw the Germans, they saw themselves as German peoples, even though for historical reasons they hadn't been linked during the original unification of Germany. And so when Hitler marched the German army across the border, they were welcomed by many Austrians who were waving Nazi flags, and so the action was actually popular, but many of Hitler's generals had worried that this was a step too far and that the Allies would respond, although once again Hitler was proved right and his allies and the generals were proved wrong. The Allies did nothing. The summer of 38 saw a new crisis begin to emerge. The area along the German-Czech border that was part of the new state of Czechoslovakia was actually inhabited by many German-speaking peoples. This area was known as the Sudetenland. In the minds of many Germans who were living here, by right, they should be part of Germany, being Germanic peoples. And the situation proved to be a crisis as Hitler began to make noise that he was going to annex these areas. In September, it seemed that crisis was averted, though, because Neville Chamberlain, representing the Allies, the French and Germans, agreed that they would allow Hitler to seize this area of the Sudetenland with its German majority. Hitler promised in return that this was the last piece of territory that he would take. And Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, famously appeared before the press when he got off the plane saying that he had secured peace for our time and that Hitler wouldn't do anything else. Well, this proved to be wrong because Hitler violated the agreement in the spring of 1939, the next year, when he seized the whole of Czechoslovakia, proving that he was not done taking territories. Yet the Allies did nothing. They wrongly believed that Hitler would not be able to make any other moves because the Soviets wouldn't allow him to do so. They were proved wrong again, though, because against what everybody thought was possible, the Soviets and the Nazis did the unthinkable. They signed a peace treaty in August of 1939. It was widely believed that the Nazis and the communists could never be friends because ideologically they were such enemies. But political ambitions sometimes make strange bedfellows. And both parties had agreed to a non-aggression pact, meaning they would not attack each other. And there was a further secret provision. They agreed to split Eastern Europe amongst themselves. And these provisions soon became public. In September of 1939, as the Nazis and Soviets moved into Eastern Europe, and the Nazis began to march into Poland and began to carve up these territories. Well, the invasion of Poland was a bridge too far. This time, the Allies had to act, and France and Britain declared war on Germany. Now, our next lecture will deal more closely with the war itself, but for this lecture, I want to focus in particularly on the Holocaust. It was against the backdrop of the chaos and the turmoil of the beginning of World War II that Nazi planners settled on a solution, as they saw it, to what they called the Jewish problem. Initially, there was debates on whether to just expel the Jews or possibly sterilize the Jews as a means of as a means of getting rid of them. But at the Wannsee Conference held in January of 1942, the final solution was settled upon. This was a plan for the mass extermination of Jews that would put the Nazi racial ideologies, would fully implement Nazi racial ideologies. The conference laid out a plan for the creation of death camps that would be spread across Europe. These camps would be different from concentration camps. Concentration camps are literally just mean camps where people are brought together. They don't necessarily involve the mass extermination, but the death camps would be designed specifically with the intent of extermination. The idea was to systematically slaughter Jews, but also gypsies, homosexuals, and other people who were deemed undesirable. Modern technology was put to use. The camps were individuals would be sent by train and cattle cars to the camps. One problem that the Nazis began to encounter, though, was that there were so many people slated for destruction that they were unable to effectively do this. And so Nazi planners began to construct gas chambers. So as people would leave the cattle cars and would enter into the death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka and places like that, people would be lined up. A doctor would be stationed at the end, and people would be segregated, not only by gender, men and women, but also they would be segregated by people who were believed, who the Nazis believed could be of some use, and people who would just immediately be sent to be exterminated. And so the doctor would be at the end of this line, and by moving his hand either to the right or left, those who were believed to be of some use were sent to slave labor camps, and those who were deemed useless were sent immediately to the gas chambers. Now, the Nazis found that it was better if people didn't know that they were going to die. They found that things ran more smoothly, and so people were lied to and told that they were just going to get a shower. They were their possessions were taken from them upon entry into the camp. Their heads were shaved, and they were herded into showers, most of them believing that they were only going to get a shower, but rather than water coming out of the spigots, they were hooked up into containers of gas. Poison gas entered the crowded room, and people slowly suffocated to death. After 10 or 15 minutes, the doors were opened up, and the dozens or hundreds of corpses were removed, and the Nazis would then put them into crematoria. This was seen as the most efficient way to dispose of the bodies. They were incinerated essentially, and just opened up for the next round of victims. Through the use of this industrial system of murder, about several millions of people were killed, about 6 million Jews, but the numbers also include gypsies and, as I said, other groups that were considered undesirable. Okay, well, when we come back next time, we are going to look at World War II itself. What I'd like you to do is to get your notes together and answer this question. How did the political, economic, and ideological conditions of the interwar years contribute to the rise of the Nazi Party? And how did these facilitate the shift from systematic persecution to the genocide known as the Holocaust?